Good evening. I'm Claire Harvey. I'm the editorial director of The Australian, which means one of my great privileges is to look after all the podcasts that we make. I'm here, of course, with Hedley Thomas and David Murray, who's our national crime correspondent. Dave and Hedley and I have become great friends over the past couple of years because we've been working very closely on the teacher's trial and the teacher's accuser and Shandee's legacy. So I feel like we have stepped into the renaissance in storytelling that is podcasting, where we're all extremely privileged to be on the cutting edge of journalism and working in a field where the Australian's audience is willing to go, that audiences are there for long-form investigative journalism, which of course is why we got into this craft in the first place. It's unforeseen, isn't it, Dave, that in 2023, long after people predicted newspapers and journalism would be dead, it's back.
Oh, look, it is incredible. I think when I started in newspapers, I thought, oh, great, I'll never have to do radio or TV. I can just cover this stuff in print. And I mean, that's just completely changed in the last few years in particular.
Yeah. And of course, Hedley has led us to this great new frontier of journalism. But what I didn't know when I stepped into your world was exactly that everybody in Brisbane journalism seems to be related and related to Hedley. So something you guys might not know is that Hedley and Dave are brothers-in-law. Yes, I know. And
everyone in Brisbane knows it's a small town, Claire.
These guys didn't know, clearly. So Tell me, how are you brothers-in-law? What's the relationship there?
Well, my wife, Ruth, who I actually met at Rick's Bar in Fortitude Valley.
That's an in-joke, I don't know.
Just over 30 years ago. Ruth's little sister, is Katrina. In fact, soon after I met Ruth and decided within about half an hour of meeting her that I actually wanted to marry her, she was going to Mackay for Christmas, and I tracked down the phone number for the Mathewson home in Mackay, and Katrina, Ruth's little sister, answered the phone and then went off squealing to her parents that her sister was being asked out on a date by this guy in Brisbane. Anyway, Katrina is Dave's partner, and so we have many happy times together. We're very close, and fortunately, Dave and I also team up on stories very effectively, and he's been an enormous help for me.
And both Ruth and Katrina are journalists too. I think we both at times said probably better journos than we are.
Well,
did you guys meet in a newsroom or at a family Christmas?
I met Dave in the newsroom, is my recollection.
Yeah. I think I was at the time working in the investigative unit at the Courier Mail. They had this tiny little room right in the bowels of the building. You could barely fit us. You had people come through there, like some of the great journalists from Australia, Paul Whittaker, Michael Ware, who became an international correspondent, and they passed through this little room, and I think that's where I remember meeting Hedley.
So I've got to stop you there because Paul Whittaker, who Dave just mentioned, became editor-in-chief of The Australian, is now running Sky News, and is also Hedley's brother-in-law.
Yeah. And when he was editor-in-chief of The Australian, he commissioned, he agreed to let me have more than 6 months just on one story, the Dawson story. Today he actually just voiced his lines for the audiobook for the book that I've done. That was a gratuitous plug. Sorry, I take that back. Sorry, delete that.
You've got a book?
Yeah. But it's quite funny because I remind Paul, who is a fantastic investigative journalist and then became a terrific editor and editor-in-chief and now CEO of Sky News, that in 1989, when he was a cadet reporter at the Courier Mail, and this was shortly after we both left the Gold Coast, where we shared a flat together, he went to Coomberbar State High for a human interest story about all of the twins at Coomberbar State High. There were about a dozen sets of twins, including several sets of teachers, and he interviewed Chris and Paul Dawson for this human interest story. And he went on to become a great investigative journalist, but he completely missed Completely missed that yarn.
He missed the yarn.
Yeah.
I hope you haven't let him forget it.
No, don't worry. Yes, it's even in the book.
Paul's nickname is Boris. He's one of the great characters of journalism. He's called Boris, I think, because he has red hair and he likes tennis.
Yes.
Is that why?
Yeah, he used to play a lot of doubles tennis on the Gold Coast with a few characters, and he and I would often team up. And Tommy Campion, who's a very colourful photographer and big character on the coast, who played with us, he nicknamed Paul Boris because at that time Boris Becker was winning Wimbledon, and they have similar playing style, not ability, but certainly style, very aggressive, and looked a little alike, yeah.
Brisbane journalism can't be talked about without mentioning Matthew Condon, who is our other partner in crime on these podcasts, and one of the most eminent journalists, of course, in Queensland. He's writing about the years of Joh Bjelke-Petersen and all the shenanigans that were going on in the Moonlight State.
I think he's also
legendary.
Related to
Is-
Hedley. No, he's not. Is he?
But Dave, did you kind of grow up knowing about Matt Condon's journalism in Queensland? He's a legendary figure here.
I didn't. I grew up in Darwin, so I was from the Northern Territory originally. But certainly, once I started working as a journalist in Brisbane, became a big admirer of Matt's work. But even more so in the last period that we've all been working together, as you said, very closely, sometimes in these tiny little booths in Sydney that they give us to record these podcast studios. You don't have much space, and just to see Matt kind of riffing off anything, and we have really a ball sort of talking together. You don't hear a lot of our outtakes, but it just had this kind of chemistry that worked really well when we were covering the trial of Christopher Dawson.
Yeah, there were famously 5 of us in a 2-person booth once in Sydney, and we can't run the air conditioning in these little booths because it makes a hum. So we're all drenched in sweat, and Matt, of course, still managed to bring out the 7-syllable words, in that environment. Hedley, you are a couple of years younger than Matt, I think.
Oh, at least a couple. A few years younger, I think. And Matt's dear mum, Karen, who passed away recently, her funeral was on Monday. And Karen, when I was 16 years old, rang the editor of the Gold Coast Bulletin, John Burton, and said to him, my friend's daughter's boyfriend could be an option to be a copy boy at your newspaper. And Matt had done his cadetship at the Bulletin, and so John Burton said, oh, well, ask him to come in and we'll have an interview. And that's how I got started in journalism, straight out of the end of year 12. And I'm so grateful to John Burton and Karen for making that call. And when you started a newspaper when you're age 17 and you start at the bottom and you see how all the different parts of the paper come together, from photographics to editorial, advertising, marketing, everything. And you're running all around all these departments. And tonight I just saw Steve Ryan, who was a photographer at the Bulletin back then in 1984, 85, when I was there, 86. And thanks very much for coming, Steve. Where are you,
Put
mate?
up your hand, Steve. Oh, there you are.
Yeah. They were good years.
Yeah. Dave, where did you start out in journalism?
I started as a cadet in the Courier Mail newsroom. So I went to university in Brisbane and finished that. And at the time, they took 5 cadets in a year, and I think that's the greatest thing for journalism. These days, we take in even more as a company at the moment, and they are spread out and they're rotated across the country. And you have to have that kind of renewal. It was so competitive to get into this field of work. I didn't know if I would get a job. Fortunately, I did. I was hired by Chris Mitchell, who then went on to become the editor of the Australian, editor-in-chief. And yeah, so that's how I got my start.
Yeah. So tell me about your work in podcasting, Dave. You've done some remarkable work, not only, of course, with us, but your own podcast, To the Lighthouse, was about the disappearance of the young backpacker Theo Hayes in Byron Bay. How did you get onto that story? How did you know it was a story, and why did you choose to do a podcast about it?
Well, I was approached by the volunteers in Byron Bay who were looking for Theo Hayes. He went missing in 2019, just here on holidays, went out one night and just vanished. And they came and they met me and they talked me through their incredible efforts, both by the family of Theo and by the community in Byron, to find him. And I was just blown away. I was completely amazed by what they'd done. They had basically been able to get into his Google account and then track his movements walking through the town, and they'd found information, way ahead of the police, and so much more information than the police had found. It was incredible. So quite often we'll get approached by people who ask us to do stories with them, and you often can only do so many. In a story like that, it requires a lot of time. So I spent 4 or 5 months working on that one project. I just finished helping on the teacher's pet in the news coverage side of things, and the podcasts. I'd become really interested in podcasts through, like most people, podcasts like Serial and Dan Box's podcast Bowerville. It had blown me away about how it showed for the first time really what journalists do. You hear the knock on the door, you hear the dogs barking as you go to a gate, and that to me just went, oh, that's actually what our job is like. And I'd never seen that described anywhere on TV and print. And then you have all the other aspects of a podcast of actually hearing people's voices. It's of course you edit it, but you get to hear what people really sound like. You get much more of a deeper connection with the story.
Dave was one of the first movers with podcasts in our company. I remember when Dave was still at the Courier Mail and I was at the Australian in Brisbane, and there was an area outside our offices that was used to be the print where the papers were printed. The presses used to be there. So as a 21, 22-year-old, I would sometimes go to this place, but the presses have long been moved to another area, and now it's just a suite of open office plan. And Dave was there trying to find a quiet place to do some narration for this podcast that he had started working on. It was about the disappearance of a teenage girl called Rachel Antonio from North Queensland. And if you haven't heard this podcast, it's really worth going back and listening to. He must have done that in 2016?
Yeah, that's right.
It was so good and really helped, I think, drive early interest in podcasts. Certainly fired my interest for doing the teacher's pet the following year. And Dave taught me a lot before I went into it and showed me what to do. I remember sharing with Dave a lot of my early scripts and asking him, what do you reckon, and getting fantastic advice because he'd already done it. He knew more than anyone what was going on.
Hedley, in your podcasting work, you've gone from, of course, the Teacher's Pet, which we first started publishing in 2018, through to your most recent investigation, Shandee's Story, which we started in 2021, I think, and then is still going. And you've really traversed a wide spectrum of there being no audio materials available and no video really of Lynn, except for a few fragments that you found, to, in Shandee's case, an absolute wealth of material that you managed to obtain. Yeah. Tell me about that richness of material and how it helps guide your journalistic choices when you're writing scripts and producing the podcast.
Yeah, I think that when you're trying to work out what investigation to take on, the material that might be available is a really important guide as to what you'll do next. If you can't put your hands on very good documentary materials such as trial transcripts or inquest transcripts or witness statements, all of that written material, and you can't help convey the person who has been murdered or who has disappeared, presumed murdered, through audio and video. It's a lot more challenging, because all you'll have are the memories, the contemporary memories of people that you're interviewing. And when these cases might go back 3 decades, 4 decades in Lynn's case, those memories are less reliable than what they were at the time the witness statements were taken, at the time that people gave evidence under oath. So it's very important for me, when I'm working out what to do, to have that I think, underpinning, that base of material. Because, we all come to these podcasts with different objectives, but I think for Dave and I and you, Claire, one of the overriding ones is, can this unsolved case potentially be solved? And you can't, in my view, come close to solving the case unless you get really lucky, without generating a lot of public interest in the story as it's unfolding. And you can't generate a lot of public interest in the story without the ballast, without the material that you're relying on to tell the story, without the documentary, without the audio and video of the victim that will, I think, cause people to focus on who we're talking about. There's a real person here. And in Shandee's case, the trove of material was unprecedented. In my career, I've never seen that kind of availability. Every witness statement that the police took, every interview that the police did, often interviews with suspects who didn't know that they were being recorded, even the audio of the police walking down Boddington Street in Mackay at about 3 o'clock in the morning to knock on the door of a woman, Vicky Blackburn, and tell her that her daughter has been killed, stabbed to death just down the road. That was recorded by the police with a device that they wear, and it's routine that they do this. And all of that audio goes into the inquest, into trial and committal proceedings and so on. And it was provided with Vicky's blessing for this podcast, Shandee's Story. And I think that it was the availability and the rawness of that material that really propelled the podcast forward and helped us get to where we got to, which was, a incredible finding about the failure of the DNA testing laboratory, and ultimately a commission of inquiry that continued for about 6 months of last year and delivered damning findings that will, with the recommendations that have been introduced, lead to a revolution in how crime scenes are being processed and DNA is being tested in Queensland.
Dave, your bread and butter is crime. Every morning when I'm in news conference, my heart sinks for poor Dave. When some crime has happened, it's like, we need to get Dave onto that. I know Dave is working on big investigations and huge stories, but suddenly he has to jump into the mushroom story or whatever it is, the crime of the day.
Yeah.
Is it a frustration of the crime journo that you know that all that material, like in Shandee's case, is there, but often you can't get it?
Yeah, look, it's kind of, that's why only certain cases really lend themselves to podcasts, because you need, as Hedley's just described, so much material to support these lengthy investigations. But, almost every story you can start with nothing, and you have to find a way to actually get into that story. And in a national newspaper like The Australian, it's not going to be necessarily in your backyard. It's going to be anywhere in the country. So you just have to find a way to find out what's going on. Whether, if the police won't talk to you, then, usually someone else will. That's just part of the game.
You've recently stepped into and really you've got the wind in your sails on a story that had been the subject of a podcast, The Lady Vanishes, but you knew that there was more to be done on that story. How did you know that the disappearance of Marion Barter was still a story, that was more to investigate there?
Look, Marion's disappearance and Marion's daughter Sally is here tonight. I hope she doesn't mind me mentioning, but was something that I wrote about 4 years ago when the Channel 7 podcast, The Lady Vanishes, was first launching, and then this year, got a message on a weekend saying, "Look, could you have a look at this again?" And I did. And I think I didn't expect to, take a deep dive into it at that point. I wrote a story for that for the paper, and a couple of days later, and it didn't quite get the run that I was kind of hoping it would, but I kind of immediately said, well, that's all right, that's good, because now we can do a bigger kind of feature for the weekend. And so that's what happened. I did a feature in the Inquirer section for that weekend, and it just really took off from there for me, because, this is such an incredible story. And the thing about Marion's disappearance is that it is only where it is today because of the sheer determination, the dedication of her daughter, of Sally, to find her, and media organisations putting the resources into researching that case, and then the public getting on board and finding the most incredible things that had been missed. And, there's many, many aspects of the investigation into Marion's disappearance that are just a failure. Like, things were not, things would not be where they are today without all those other elements coming together. So it shows what can be done, if if you have the right circumstances, media get involved. Often police won't want you involved. It could be potentially they might think that you're going to interfere with their investigation, or they might be worried about being embarrassed. It could be any number of reasons.
That power of the audience that Dave has spoken about has been a big part of projects like The Teacher's Pet, Hedley. Immense audience engagement, of course, which makes it possible for us to do this kind of journalism. But also, journalism is now a two-way street, right? You're getting information from the audience in real time.
And that was crucial to the momentum that The Teacher's Pet developed during 2018. We were releasing a weekly episode, and I thought that there might end up being 8 episodes. It ended up being 16. And the reason was, when the series started, it started when it was incomplete. I hadn't written 8 episodes. I hadn't done all the interviews. I didn't have the material to support 8 episodes. I'd written in draft form 4 episodes, and they were ready to go. And most of those episodes had been built by Slade Gibson, the audio engineer, absolute champion bloke, lives in the Gap, and used to play. He was a guitarist for Savage Garden. He hates it when I say that.
Yeah,
you say it every time.
I was going to say it if you didn't say it. He's a genuine rock star, and yet he is the most humble and sort of
beautiful man.
Retiring chap, isn't he?
Yeah. And so, if I had done The Teacher's Pet in a conventional way, I would have written and Slade would have built all 8 episodes before we released episode 1, because they're weekly episodes and lots can go wrong, big legal risks. You can't just wing these things. But we decided to wing it after...
Why did you decide to wing it?
I was just impatient to start releasing it. I wanted it to go out. I knew it was such an important story, and I thought, it could take me another 3 or 4 weeks to finish writing the other 30 or 40,000 words I've got to do for the other episodes, and so I just thought I'll be able to handle this, because we've got these first 3 or 4 pretty much done, and when the first one goes out, I'll just be working on episode 4 or 5, and then the second one goes out, I'll be on the next one, and that'll be all right, But of course, there's a deluge of information that starts coming in. We've suddenly ripped the Band-Aid off this story, off this case that had haunted many people who knew Lynn, who knew a number of the students from those high schools, particularly Cromer High, people who'd grown up on the northern beaches, the children of students of those schools who had been raised with their parents telling them about this case, about this teacher who they were sure had killed his wife and buried her under the tennis court or the school's library. There were all these different rumours about where Paul Lynn's remains were buried, but nobody was in any doubt that she'd been killed. And it was like this extraordinary community knowledge that had never been properly developed or properly investigated by police. I should add that it was well investigated by Damien Loon over a number of years, but in the early years it was not investigated well at all by police.
That process of releasing an episode a week while making that episode, in fact, because eventually it caught up with you, right? Slade Gibson described it as laying the tracks while the train is approaching.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Slade has a number of wonderful turns of phrase, and I love this relationship between the journo who'd never made a podcast, the rock star who'd never made a podcast.
Yeah.
How did you and Slade, what did you learn from Slade? How did you guys work together?
Well, it was just such a wonderful coincidence that I was even knowing Slade. We've all heard of Trent Dalton, an absolute legend.
Is he related as well? Yeah.
My wife wishes he were. She's a bit in love with him.
Everyone is.
Yeah. So Trent works with us, or used to work with us in the Australian, and Trent is best friends with Slade Gibson, and I needed to do audio trailers for The Teacher's Pet before it had been released. You know, I was told that you've got to go and do these like 3 or 4 minute kind of promotions before it goes out, and the whole podcasting genre was so new to me. I had no idea what was going on, so I just did what I was told. Some people would say that's a first, but I did it. And I would go over to Slade's studio, and the more I went over and talked to him about the case, the more I realised that he had these incredible insights and wisdom and really high EQ understandings of different quite complex parts of the story in relation to the different connections between some of the key people, you know, Chanel and her father, and Chanel and her uncle, and Marilyn, who was Lynn's sister-in-law, and the woman that Chris Dawson groomed as a schoolgirl. And Slade had you know, just a much gentler and I think a wiser understanding of all of this, and I realised that he would be a great person to work with on the podcast. Up to that point, it was going to be built in Sydney by our audio people in Sydney, which made it really difficult because you need, I think, to be in the same studio. You need to be in the same room. You need to be having regular contact. There's such, well, it seemed at the time anyway, they're so complicated and difficult to put together, and so that Slade was just the answer to all of it. And I remember when I proposed to Paul Whittaker, my brother-in-law, one of my best friends, and I said, mate, we really need Slade to do this. And Paul was like, well, it's not budgeted, you know. I mean, you've already spent 4 frickin' months on this story. When are we going to get it? And, you know, it's costing a fortune. And I said, yeah, but it's going to be so much better if you know, can find some money for Slade to build it. And Slade underquoted because he really wanted to do it. He knew it was important, and we got on so well. And, you know, it wouldn't be what it became if he hadn't done that. But the hours and the effort were extraordinary, particularly when we lost our buffer of episodes and we were producing 12, 14,000 word episodes, writing them from scratch, editing them and getting the finished product all legaled in just a few days so that they could be released on time. And Slade actually started hiding under his bed when he knew I was coming up the long driveway. He'd had it. And we ended up with 16 episodes before we both said, we've got to pause.
I'd love you guys to ask us some questions. So I've got one more question for the guys and then I'm going to throw it to you. Next Friday, Christopher Michael Dawson is back in court. We've all spent lots of time in courtrooms. Dave, I think you've spent the highest number of days in a court looking right at Chris Dawson. This is sentencing submissions for his conviction for unlawful carnal knowledge of a schoolgirl. And then 2 weeks later, there'll be the actual sentence. So the sentencing submissions, Dave, tell us what you're expecting from that hearing. And that, yes, that does mean I do want you to come down.
Yeah. Oh, look, I mean, and Claire drove our coverage of that carnal knowledge trial, made sure we're all together covering that. Look, I expect Chris Dawson will probably, roll out every reason under the sun for why he shouldn't get a tougher sentence or something that's at the end of the tougher scale. Will it make much difference either way what the sentence is? I mean, he's not getting out of prison due to the murder conviction unless he somehow manages to overturn a very seasoned judge's very well considered sentence, a conviction of him. But look, I think regardless of what the sentence is, I think the actual conviction would have been so important to the victim in that case, who went, got to give her credit, she went and gave evidence during a very intense murder trial with all the attention that was on it, with all the kind of pressure that was put on her. But she wanted what happened to her to be in a courtroom, and she followed that through. And again, a judge looked at that and said, yeah, he did it, he's guilty.
I've covered a lot of sexual assault trials, as have you guys, and this was the first one that I'd sat in where the benefit of legislative reform to protect victims, I really saw it. When the complainant was giving evidence, she didn't have to be in the same room as the accused. She didn't have to look at him. She didn't even have to look at us or any members of the public. So members of the public were asked to leave the courtroom. We were asked to move into the jury box so that she couldn't see us. Of course, this was a judge alone trial. It was quite remarkable, wasn't it, that in, I think, a pretty short space of time, we've seen a huge leap in the way complainants and victims are treated in courtrooms. Hedley, in the years since you made the teacher's pet, the Me Too revolution has happened. Has that changed the way you have thought about these topics of grooming, of child sexual abuse, of this young woman's story in relation to that?
Yeah, in fact, the Harvey Weinstein scandal was actually unfolding when I was going through the research phase for the teacher's pet in late 2017. And I remember driving out to the town of Miles over the Dividing Range past Toowoomba, west of Toowoomba, to meet a former St Ursula's college schoolgirl who had seen Chris Dawson grooming other girls at that school years after he'd left the Northern Beaches. I mean, it's hard to believe, isn't it, that this man who had done what he did at Cromer High on the Northern Beaches moves to Queensland and ends up, having been accused by his second wife of having murdered his first wife, he ends up teaching at an all-girls school in Yeppoon, but that's what happened. But on that trip, the Harvey Weinstein was, I remember listening to a documentary about it on the way out there. And on the way back, I remember the Brian, Don Burke, the gardener. Yeah,
yes.
He was being accused of misogyny and harassment and so on. And it was all coming together at that time. And I think that, the arguments that have been playing out over recent times that it has for some people gone too far. I think that those arguments possibly have some force. But right when I was in the research phase and developing the teacher's pet, those passions and the emotions no doubt unleashed a lot of the disclosures from school students of the Northern Beaches who talked to me about not just what was going on at Cromer High, but at their high schools, completely unrelated to Chris Dawson, and many other women from around Australia and around the world. One of the challenges that I had after Chris Dawson was charged was meeting the demands of the defence legal team. They wanted not just all of my interviews, all of my audio, they wanted all of the emails that I had received, unsolicited emails from listeners, hundreds and hundreds of emails from listeners who believed that this case had special touchstones for them in their lives, and it gave them an opportunity to express, sometimes for the first time, what had happened to them in sexual assault, in a rape. And they were disclosing these things in the emails, which I was then being told I had to hand over, completely irrelevant to Chris Dawson's murder case. But I had to take advice on what we could redact and what we could avoid handing over. And I've never had that kind of reaction in terms of people sharing their experiences, and I think that it was partly because of Lynn's story and the way that people identified with what happened to her, and partly because of the time.
I mean, that is me too, right? That is people saying, this happened to me too, you know, and I think we've all got a fluency in the language of this. Dave, I was interested during the carnal knowledge trial that we heard the complainant say, in fact, she'd said it during the murder trial, I was groomed. I was being groomed by a pedophile.
Yeah, she clearly reflected on those events, you know, for a long time, and you know, the damage that it inflicted on her was just so obvious when we were sitting in the court and watching her give evidence. Yeah.
I mean, when she gave her first police statement in 1990, she was in her mid-20s. And you don't see in that first police statement that flavour of, I was groomed, I was a victim of this or that.
I don't think that was even a word that we used
that's right.
in 1994
and
or whatever it was.
And then she gives a second police statement in 1998. So she's another 8 years older. And again, she's quite selflessly talking more about what happened to Lynn and Chris Dawson's actions that she believed were deeply suspicious and likely connected to his murder of Lynn. And I think that we've all been on a journey in terms of understanding, you know, grooming and the impacts of it. And that's why when we get to 2022 and the murder trial, and 2023 and June this year and the carnal knowledge trial, the evidence of people like Chris Dawson's accuser is what it is calling out the fact that she was groomed, and she uses that word repeatedly, and she's clearly become very knowledgeable about the process and what happened to her. And you hear a sort of a righteous anger in her because her life, she believed, had been destroyed by his conduct, his very selfish conduct.
By the time of that second statement, she was also a mother of a teenage girl. So I think many of us have had that experience as a parent of seeing your child grow up and realising that this is still a child. You know, I don't know. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I imagine part of it might have been realising that at 15, when she met him, she was a child still. You know, and you know, maybe being able to let go of a little bit of the idea that she had that she was a willing participant or that she wanted this to be happening.